When the model gets too clean. You've seen the moment when a spreadsheet says approved, while your stomach says, this will hurt someone. The number is tidy, the story is messy, and the meeting moves on because the tidy thing is easier to defend. In ordinary life, we keep running into this friction, the need to measure and decide at speed, and the knowledge that people do not live at the average. When the model is clean enough to silence debate, we should ask what kind of human reality it has trimmed away to become that clean. When models are made too clean to argue with, they often hide the very people and conditions that carry the risk, and responsibility shifts from human judgment to technical compliance. This sermon will claim something limited but important. Measurement is not the enemy, and models are not inherently cruel. They are tools that encode choices about what counts. It will also refuse two easy moves. It will not call for abandoning quantification, and it will not pretend that better data alone will save us from hard questions. We will stay with the tension between legibility and fidelity, and we will look for what becomes invisible when we optimize away disagreement. To speak clearly, we need a few plain definitions, not because definitions are sacred, but because systems exploit vagueness. When words stay fuzzy, responsibility tends to evaporate. First term, measurement. Measurement is any method we use to turn lived reality into something we can compare. Numbers, categories, scores, rankings, thresholds. In ordinary examples, a wait time in minutes, a performance rating from 1 to 5, a risk score, a pass-fail checklist. Measurement helps us coordinate, budget, and plan. It also compresses. It takes something wide and textured and turns it into a line. Second term, model. A model is a simplified representation of how we believe something works, used to make predictions or decisions. Sometimes it is a formula, sometimes it is a rubric, sometimes it is a flowchart that says, if A, then do B. A model is never the world. It is a claim about the world. Even when it is accurate in many cases, it is still a reduction. Third term, abstraction. Abstraction is the act of ignoring detail so that we can see a pattern. In ordinary life, a map is an abstraction. It shows roads and leaves out the smell of the street, the uneven curb, the fact that a crossing is frightening for someone with limited mobility. Abstraction is not a mistake. It is how we think at scale. But abstraction has a cost, and the cost is often paid by the people whose lives depend on the details. Fourth term, tail risk. Tail risk is the risk of rare, extreme outcomes, the scenarios that do not happen often but are disproportionately harmful when they do. If a model says, most of the time this is fine, tail risk is the in when it's not fine. Someone gets crushed part. The tail lives at the edge of the distribution, and systems often treat the edge as optional. Now a key assumption. Decisions are made under constraints. Time, budgets, staffing, attention. Models exist because we cannot hold every detail in mind at once. Another assumption, the point of measurement is not only accuracy, it is also defensibility. We measure so we can justify decisions to others and to ourselves. That is where the ethical pressure enters. A measurement can become less about understanding and more about permission, and we must separate intent from impact explicitly. The intent behind a model is often reasonable. Reduce bias, allocate resources fairly, detect risk early, improve consistency. The impact can still be harm, people being misclassified, dignity being reduced to compliance, agency being constrained by a score they cannot question. Intent is not impact. A well-intended model can still build a world where certain people are routinely disbelieved. So when we ask, what becomes invisible when models are made too clean to argue with, we are asking, what details were cut away to create clarity, and who loses protection when that clarity becomes authority? Consider a simple example. A team decides to rate service quality by average handling time. The intent, help more people, reduce backlog. The metric is clean, minutes. The chart shows improvement. But one caller is hard of hearing, needs repetition, needs patience. Another caller is speaking a second language and needs clarification. Another is in a crisis and cannot give a neat summary. These are not edge cases in human terms. They are human beings. Yet they become outliers in the model, and outliers become problems. The metric does not say slow because care was required. It says slow. The model makes a kind of care invisible by calling it inefficiency. That example is not about villains. It is about how a measurement can be both useful and deforming. It helps the organization see something. It also trains the organization to stop seeing something else. Once a model exists, it begins to negotiate power, not because it is malicious, but because it reduces ambiguity. Ambiguity is where conversation happens. It is also where responsibility lives. A clean model shrinks the space for judgment, and judgment is where we can notice dignity. Let's name 3 tensions that show up again and again: scale versus care, automation versus agency, metrics versus dignity. Scale versus care. Scale asks, how do we do this for 10 times as many people with the same resources? Care asks, what does this person need in their particular context? These are not enemies, but they pull in different directions. Scale wants standardization. Care wants responsiveness. A clean model is often the compromise. It gives the appearance of caring consistently by caring in a standardized way. It can encode a minimum baseline, but it can also cap compassion at what can be measured. Automation versus agency. Automation asks, can the decision be made without the friction of human deliberation? Agency asks, does the person affected have meaningful input, recourse, or consent? Automation tends to treat disagreement as noise. Agency treats disagreement as information, often the information that the model is missing a reality. Metrics versus dignity. Metrics ask, what can we count? Dignity asks, what should not be reduced to account? Dignity does not oppose measurement. It insists that some values do not fit cleanly into a single score without losing their meaning. When a system treats a person as a data point first and a person second, dignity becomes a rounding error. Now, why do models become too clean to argue with? Because organizations are rewarded for decisiveness, speed, and consistency. A model that produces clear outputs reduces conflict. It simplifies training. It protects decision-makers from being personally blamed because they can point to the rule. This is how incentives turn good intentions into harm. A team might begin with a sincere goal: reduce unfairness. They build a standardized rubric so decisions are not arbitrary. That can be a real improvement over informal judgment that carries hidden bias. But then the rubric becomes the primary object of management. People are evaluated on following the rubric, not on whether the rubric is faithful to reality. The model becomes a shield. 2 failure modes follow, one at the level of the individual, one at the level of the system. Individual level failure mode: moral offloading into compliance. A person stops asking, is this right in this case? And starts asking only, is this allowed by the model? Their responsibility narrows to procedural correctness. They become less cruel perhaps, but also less awake. They may even feel virtuous. I treated everyone the same, but sameness is not the same as fairness, and procedural sameness can be a way of refusing to see context. You can recognize this failure mode when someone says, my hands are tied, and means it not as a lament, but as a closure. The model becomes the boundary of imagination. System-level failure mode: feedback loops that optimize the proxy. The system begins to reward whatever improves the metric, even if the metric is only a proxy for the real goal. The model becomes self-justifying. It defines success, measures success, and then uses measured success to prove it is working. Take the earlier handling time example. If promotions, staffing, and praise flow to those who lower average time, then people will lower average time. They may rush callers, avoid complex cases, transfer more often, or subtly discourage those who need more help. The model shows progress, while the lived experience deteriorates for the people who cost more time. The model will also make those people harder to see because they may stop using the service altogether. The metric improves further. The proxy has eaten the purpose. Notice what happens to tail risk in that loop. The rare extreme harms: someone who gives up on getting help, someone who receives wrong guidance because the call was rushed, someone who is screened out, remains statistically small. The chart stays clean. The people at the edge become less present in the data because they are less present in the system. This is one of the most important ways harm becomes invisible. The harmed person leaves the measurement frame. There is another way cleanliness happens: by removing contestability. A model is arguable when you can question its categories, its data sources, its thresholds, and its trade-offs. A model becomes too clean when it is presented as pure technical necessity. When people hear "the model says" and stop there. When the act of questioning is treated as ignorance rather than governance. But every model includes choices. Which outcomes count? Over what time horizon? Whose perspective defines success? Which errors are acceptable? False positives or false negatives? Who bears the cost of each kind of mistake? Clean models often hide these choices behind neutral language. They turn normative decisions into technical parameters. They say confidence interval instead of some people will be wrongly denied. They say acceptable loss instead of acceptable harm. They say edge cases instead of people with less power. Cleanliness is itself a valued choice. It values decisiveness over deliberation, standardization over contextual listening, and institutional protection over shared accountability. Legibility is gained, fidelity is lost. The question is not whether we will simplify, we will. The question is whether the simplification is honest about what it discards, and whether we keep channels open for the discarded reality to speak back. A clean model tends to remove three kinds of friction. 1. The friction of narrative, the story that does not fit the category. 2. The friction of exception, the case that requires judgment. 3. The friction of responsibility, the discomfort of owning trade-offs. Those frictions are often where human dignity is protected. When we remove them entirely, we get efficiency without mercy, not as a feeling, but as a structural absence of room for human variance. At this point, it helps to ask, who benefits from cleanliness, and who pays for it? Beneficiaries often include managers who need consistent reporting, teams who need to train quickly, institutions that need defensibility, and sometimes even users who want predictable outcomes. These are not illegitimate benefits. The costs are often externalities. They are borne by people who are harder to categorize, who have less time to appeal, who cannot easily switch providers, or who are already carrying the burden of being misunderstood. When a model becomes a gate, those people become the gate's casualties. This is also where consent comes in. Most people affected by models did not consent to the model's categories, and they often cannot see how they are being measured. They experience the model as fate, even though it is design. So the systemic tension is not model or no model. It is, can we build models that remain answerable to human realities, especially the realities that are inconvenient to scale? When models become too clean to argue with, the first-order effect is usually speed. Faster decisions, clearer reporting, less dispute. The second-order effects are subtler, and they persist because they are compatible with the incentives of organizations. One second-order effect is the relocation of risk from the center of attention to the edges of experience. In the center, the model performs well. Average outcomes, common cases, repeatable workflows. The system learns to celebrate itself there. At the edges live the complicated cases, the rare conditions, the intersecting constraints. The model either handles them poorly or excludes them outright. But because these cases are less visible in aggregate metrics, the system learns to underinvest in them. Tail risk is not only statistical, it is social. It is the risk that those at the margins will be treated as acceptable collateral for the comfort of the majority. Another second-order effect is a change in identity, both personal and institutional. On the personal side, workers inside the system begin to see their role differently. If their job is to execute the model, then their craft becomes compliance. They may become less skilled at judgment and more skilled at justification. They may stop noticing what is not counted, because noticing does not pay. Attention shapes behavior, identity, and outcome. When attention is trained on the score, people become score producers. On the institutional side, the organization begins to treat the model's outputs as reality itself. The model becomes the thing the organization knows. People then become what the organization can know about them. That is a quiet diminishment of dignity. A person becomes legible only through the system's lens. A third second-order effect is the narrowing of what can be said. When a model is clean and authoritative, it constrains language. It becomes difficult to voice experiences that contradict it. If someone says, the metric says we improved, but people are suffering, they can be dismissed as anecdotal. If someone says, this category doesn't fit my situation, they can be told, that's not how the system works. A clean model can function like a social veto. This is not about rejecting evidence. It is about recognizing that evidence is framed. The model decides what counts as evidence. And when the model's categories define reality, those categories become a constraint on speech. A fourth second-order effect is the creation of invisible stakeholders, people affected by the model who are not present when the model is evaluated. Here is one concrete example of an excluded stakeholder and a hidden cost. Imagine a benefits application process that uses a risk model to detect fraud and speed approvals. The intent is partly humane: get help to people quickly and reduce misuse so the program can continue. The model is tuned to minimize one kind of error, approving ineligible cases. That's a defensible goal. But the cost of false suspicion is not evenly distributed. Some applicants have irregular work histories, unstable addresses, non-standard family arrangements, or limited access to documentation. They are more likely to be flagged. The model's cleanliness, its clear thresholds, produces a clear outcome. Needs review. Denied. Delayed. The excluded stakeholder is the person who doesn't have the time, literacy, language access, or emotional bandwidth to appeal. They are not in the meeting where the model is tuned. They are not present in the success metrics, if the metric is reduced fraud rate or faster average processing time. They may disappear from the dataset entirely because they stop applying. The system reads that as reduced demand or improved efficiency. The hidden cost is borne in private: unpaid bills, disrupted stability, dependence on informal support networks, or simply the erosion of trust. The model did not intend that. But impact is where responsibility lives. Why do these consequences persist? Because clean models are administratively convenient. They make governance easier in the narrow sense: fewer exceptions, fewer disputes, clearer accountability lines. They also create a story of rationality that organizations want to believe about themselves. We are fair because we are consistent. And because the harm is often distributed and delayed. A single extreme failure may be treated as an anomaly. Smaller harms may be absorbed quietly by those with less power to complain. The system can remain successful for a long time while producing steady, low-visibility harm. There is also a trade-off in transparency. Some models are black boxes because they are complex. Others are effectively opaque because they are presented without a meaningful way to contest them. Even a simple model can be non-consensual if the person affected cannot understand how to change their outcome, cannot challenge the inputs, or cannot request a human review. When contestability is missing, agency shrinks. People adjust themselves to the system rather than the system adjusting to people. They learn what the model rewards, and they reshape their behavior to survive it. That reshaping can look like improvement to the system and feel like distortion to the person. This is one of the deepest dignitary harms of over-clean modeling. It encourages people to become legible rather than to be understood. There is a final consequence worth naming: the displacement of responsibility. A model is built by humans, deployed by humans, and maintained by humans. Yet once it is embedded, responsibility becomes hard to locate. The designer says, "I only built the tool." The operator says, "I only followed the output." The manager says, "I only followed policy." The policy writer says, "I only followed the data." Responsibility becomes distributed, and in being distributed, it can also become dissolved. But responsibility is not eliminated by complexity. Complexity only makes it easier to pretend. So the question returns with sharper edges. When the model is too clean to argue with, it is not only hiding tail risk, it is hiding the human hands that chose where the risk would land. None of this means we should refuse models. It means we should stop mistaking cleanliness for truth. Legibility is not the same as fidelity. Consistency is not the same as justice. And optimization is not the same as care. The trade-offs are real. Models can reduce arbitrary treatment. They can reveal patterns that intuition misses. They can help allocate scarce resources. They can protect against some forms of bias. But every protection has a shadow. A model protects the system from some errors by accepting other errors. The ethical question is not, will there be error, but whose error counts, and who pays when the error happens. If the answer to that is always the person with the least access pays, then the model is clean in the way a sanitized room is clean. It has pushed the mess somewhere else. So what do we do with this knowledge without reaching for a neat fix? We begin by noticing that argument is not a nuisance. It is a signal. When a model is arguable, it remains connected to human pluralism, the fact that people experience the same system differently, and that those differences matter. A model that cannot be argued with is not merely efficient, it is insulated. There is a difference between clarity and closure. Clean models tend to offer closure, a decision, a score, an output. Human life often needs clarity without closure, an honest acknowledgement of uncertainty, trade-offs, and the limits of what we can know. Reflection here is not a belief. It is a practice. It looks like returning to a few questions again and again, especially when the charts look good. What did we choose to measure because it was easy? And what did we stop measuring because it was hard? Who became more legible, and who became more invisible? Where did we place the burden of proof? On the system to justify its categories, or on the person to justify their exception? What forms of consent exist for the person being modeled? Can they understand the categories? Can they contest the inputs? Can they appeal the outcome? Do they have meaningful agency, or only the illusion of it? What tail risks are we tolerating, and have we named them as harms rather than as statistical leftovers? And a quieter question: what kind of person does this system train me to be? A person who listens for the story, or a person who hunts for the checkbox? A person who can hold ambiguity, or a person who reaches for the number to end the conversation? It may help to hold two truths at once. First, we need measurement. Without it, power hides in unspoken discretion. Without it, decisions become more arbitrary, more dependent on mood, more dependent on who is liked. Second, measurement is a kind of force. It shapes what people do, what they are rewarded for, and what they are punished for. It can reduce harm in one direction and intensify harm in another. If we can hold both truths, we can resist the temptation to treat models as either villains or saviors. We can treat them as governance artifacts, tools that require ongoing moral attention, not because of metaphysics, but because of dignity. And we can leave space for the possibility that some of what matters most will remain partly unmeasurable. Trust, safety, belonging, the feeling of being heard, the relief of being treated as more than a case. When a model becomes too clean to argue with, it may be time not for rebellion or surrender, but for renewed attentiveness, to costs, to consent, to the people who are easiest to exclude because they are hardest to summarize. Not a solution, just a posture, refusing to let the cleanliness of a system become the final word about what is real. Care is a constraint, not a sentiment.